The chapel was too quiet, the guests too still, and Celia Thornwick understood with a sickening clarity that if she spoke now, if she whispered even the smallest plea, no one in this room would save her, for every face turned toward her belonged not to witnesses but to silent accomplices of her undoing, and the moment that truth settled inside her, fear tightened its grip around her throat until she could scarcely breathe. The candles flickered along the aisle, their wavering flames throwing trembling shadows over the cold stone floor, and as she stood beside Lord Brantham Crowell, who waited with the calm expectancy of a hunter about to close his trap, she felt the world narrowing to a suffocating point of no return. Her father watched with hardened approval, the priest droned with mechanical indifference, and Brantham's hand, gloved and motionless at his side, felt like a threat even without touching her. Celia tried to steady her breath, but dread pressed against her ribs with such force that her vision blurred, and she realized she was seconds away from vowing herself to a man whose reputation whispered danger in every corner of society, a man who had cornered her into obedience with smiles far more frightening than his silences, a man she feared would destroy her life the moment he claimed it. The priest lifted his book. Brantham angled his head toward her, his eyes glinting with cold possession. Celia's heart thrashed desperately, begging her to run, to resist, to scream, but her body remained frozen, conditioned by months of threats disguised as promises, and promises that sounded like sentences. She opened her lips, but no sound came, and in the instant she realized the ceremony was truly beginning, that she was about to lose herself forever. The heavy chapel doors burst open with a crash, so violent the walls seemed to shake. Gasps rippled through the congregation as a man stepped into the aisle, framed by blinding daylight and authority, sharp enough to silence every whisper. Celia blinked, unable to comprehend what she saw. Aldric Hawthorne, Duke of Graymoor, dressed in black riding attire, posture rigid with purpose, expression carved from stone. His voice carried through the chapel with absolute command as he announced the ceremony could not continue, that it was legally obstructed, that the bride was under coercion, and therefore this union could not be sanctified under law nor God. Brantham's fury ignited in an instant, his jaw tightening with barely contained violence, but the Duke did not look at him. He looked only at Celia, and in that moment she felt something she had not felt in months, the impossible sensation of safety piercing through fear. Her world, which had been shrinking with every breath, suddenly widened, reshaped by the presence of a man she barely knew yet somehow trusted, and as the chapel erupted into chaos around them, Celia understood that her life had just changed irrevocably. The chapel dissolved into frantic whispers and scraping footsteps, as Aldric Hawthorne's declaration tore through the ceremony like a blade, but Celia stood unmoving, her breath caught between disbelief and fragile hope, unsure whether she was witnessing salvation or stepping into yet another unknown, capable of breaking her. The Duke strode forward with unflinching purpose, documents in hand, his voice cutting cleanly through Brantham's enraged protests as he presented legal grounds for halting the marriage, evidence of coercion, witness statements regarding threats, and a signed petition demanding immediate inquiry. Celia watched in stunned silence as Brantham's composure cracked, his mask slipping just enough for the congregation to glimpse the cruelty she had lived beneath for months. Her father sputtered objections, insisting she was merely overwhelmed by nerves, but Aldric silenced him with a single, authoritative command that shifted the power in the room entirely. Celia had never seen a man stand so unwaveringly against Brantham. It was as though the Duke were built from something colder, stronger, incapable of being intimidated by rank, influence, or threats. When Aldric extended his hand toward her, she hesitated, not from distrust, but from the shock of being offered a choice at all. Brantham hissed her name in warning, the sound sharp enough to slice through her spine, and for a heartbeat she felt the old fear dragging her backward, reminding her of every whispered threat he had ever breathed against her future, her family, her safety. But Aldric's gaze held none of Brantham's darkness. It held expectation, resolve, and something steady enough to anchor her shaking breath. Celia stepped toward him, her decision trembling on unsteady legs, and the Duke positioned himself between her and Brantham with a deliberate, protective stillness that made her feel, however briefly, safe. Brantham lunged, fury burning through every line of his face, but Aldric blocked his advance with a command for the guards to restrain him, and the authority in his voice was so absolute that even the most hesitant obeyed without question. The Duke guided Celia toward the doors, shielding her from the chaos erupting behind them. She heard Brantham shouting, her father arguing, the congregation buzzing with scandal, but Aldric did not look back. He only tightened his hold as though ensuring she did not falter. Once outside, the air hit her like a cold plunge, and for the first time in months, she inhaled without feeling a hand closing around her throat. Yet confusion churned beneath her ribs. Why had a duke intervened in the life of a woman he scarcely knew, risking his own reputation for someone who had nothing to offer him? Aldric did not answer her unspoken questions. He simply led her toward his waiting carriage with the same unwavering certainty he had displayed inside the chapel. And as Celia climbed into the vehicle, heart still trembling, she realized she was leaving one prison behind, without yet understanding the nature of the world she was stepping into, or the man who had just altered the course of her life. The carriage lurched forward with a jolt that sent Celia gripping the edge of the seat, her pulse still thrumming with the remnants of the chaos she had fled, and as the chapel disappeared behind them, swallowed by distance and dust, she wondered if she had escaped only to tumble into another life she was utterly unprepared to face. Aldric Hawthorne sat across from her, his tall frame rigid, his expression carved in the same implacable stillness he had carried into the ceremony, and for several long minutes, the only sound inside the carriage was the rhythmic clatter of wheels on uneven road, a steady beat that somehow made Celia's thoughts even more frantic. She studied him in furtive glances, his gloved hands resting firmly on his knees, the faint tension in his jaw, the restrained way he breathed as though the air itself required discipline, and she could not unravel how a man so feared for his severity would involve himself in the affairs of a woman whose name he could not have known before this morning. The question trembled on her tongue, but uncertainty kept it trapped in her throat. At last, Aldric spoke, his voice stripped of ornament, offering facts with clinical precision. The law permitted intervention in weddings conducted under coercion. Brantham had been under quiet investigation for months, and Celia was now under the Duke's temporary protection until the inquiry reached resolution. The words were meant to reassure, yet they only deepened the bewilderment circling inside her chest. She asked in a whisper why he had involved himself, why he had chosen this moment, this ceremony, this life of hers to step into. Aldric's gaze held hers for a measured breath, and though his answer was simple, because it was necessary, something in his tone suggested far more lived beneath the surface, something he had chosen not to explain. Celia felt the weight of his restraint, not coldness but a carefully constructed wall, meant to keep emotion from interfering with judgment. The countryside blurred beyond the small carriage window, fields giving way to forest, forest giving way to the rolling hills that signaled Graymoor territory, and with every passing mile Celia's fear shifted, softening from panic into a quieter apprehension that left room for something far more dangerous: curiosity. She noticed the Duke's subtle glances toward her whenever the carriage jolted, the way he adjusted his posture as though mentally calculating how best to shield her should an unseen threat arise, and the faint crease between his brows that deepened whenever she struggled for breath. He was not indifferent. He was cautious, too cautious, almost painfully so. When the silhouette of Graymoor Hall finally rose against the horizon, its massive stone walls standing like a fortress carved into the land itself, Celia felt her heart leap in contradictory directions. Salvation and uncertainty waited in the same place, and as Aldric stepped out first and extended his hand toward her once more, she realized she was about to cross a threshold that would redefine everything she knew about safety and about the man who now held her fate within the quiet, unspoken gravity of his protection. Graymoor Hall loomed ahead like a stone sentinel rising from the earth, a structure so vast and imposing that Celia felt momentarily dwarfed by its sheer presence, and by the time Aldric guided her through its grand entrance, she was acutely aware of how easily she could be swallowed by a world so unfamiliar and formidable. The entry hall was cold and echoing, its marble floors gleaming beneath tall windows, and as the Duke dismissed his guards with a curt nod, the silence wrapped around them with a strange finality that made Celia feel both safer and more exposed. Aldric led her into a private study, the room lined with shelves of dark wood and heavy books, the atmosphere thick with the gravity of a man accustomed to carrying burdens no one else would dare shoulder. He motioned for her to sit, then began explaining the legal grounds that had allowed him to interrupt the ceremony. His tone remained even, but the substance of his words made her skin prickle. Coercion nullified any engagement contract. Numerous whispers had circulated about Brantham's dealings with vulnerable families, and authorities had quietly begun assembling testimony long before her name became entangled in his schemes. Celia listened, struggling to reconcile the life she had narrowly escaped with the truth. Aldric unfolded before her. She had known Brantham was fearsome, but she had not understood the full breadth of his influence, how many young women he had cornered, how many families he had manipulated, how many lives he had tightened his grip around simply because he could. When Aldric revealed she was not the first to be pushed toward an unwanted marriage, Celia felt her stomach twist in horror and guilt. She had thought herself uniquely unfortunate, but now she realized she was merely one in a line of quiet casualties. A tremor worked through her as she whispered that she had not known any of this, and Aldric, watching her with a steadiness that seemed carved from patience itself, replied that she was never meant to know. Brantham's power depended on silence. Before Celia could fully absorb the weight of those words, a knock sounded at the door and a guard entered swiftly, handing Aldric a small sealed note. The Duke's eyes narrowed as he scanned its contents, and Celia recognized the tension tightening his posture even before he spoke. Brantham had already begun mobilizing his remaining allies, vowing retribution, and insisting the Duke had overstepped the bounds of law. A chill spread down Celia's spine, her fragile sense of security cracking at the edges. Aldric folded the letter with deliberate calm, his expression unreadable, but his voice carrying a certainty that steadied her, in spite of the fear clawing at her chest. She was safe here, under his protection, and he would not allow Brantham to touch her again. Yet Celia sensed something beneath his assurance, something unspoken and heavy, a personal stake he would not name. And as she looked at the man who had disrupted her wedding, and now stood between her and the life she feared, she realized she knew almost nothing about him, except that whatever force governed his actions, it was powerful enough to challenge a man like Brantham without hesitation. Celia followed Aldric through the corridors of Graymoor Hall, each hallway stretching longer and grander than the last. And though the estate's imposing beauty might have inspired awe in another circumstance, she felt too overwhelmed by uncertainty to do more than observe its details with cautious, drifting attention. The walls were lined with portraits of Hawthorne ancestors, stern faces painted in somber tones, while polished floors reflected the soft glow of sconces set at perfect intervals, their warm light at odds with the cold grandeur of the house itself. Servants moved with quiet efficiency, bowing respectfully as the Duke passed, their expressions revealing not surprise at seeing a strange young woman beside him, but a careful curiosity that made Celia instinctively straighten her posture, as though propriety alone could keep her from unraveling. Aldric's presence, steady and composed, acted as both shield and barrier, offering security while reminding her she was still very much a guest whose place in his world remained undefined. He led her to a private suite on the eastern side of the hall, a set of rooms far larger than anything she had ever called her own. The moment Celia stepped inside, she felt the weight of the past hours settle heavily onto her shoulders. The space was elegant, creamy walls, soft drapery, and a canopied bed that seemed to swallow the room in warmth, but she could not imagine belonging in a place so refined. Aldric instructed the staff to provide whatever she required, and then dismissed them with a tone that made it clear her comfort was not optional but mandated. When the door closed behind them, Celia found herself alone with the Duke, an intimacy she had not anticipated. He kept a careful distance as he spoke, informing her that she would be safe here, that his household was loyal, and that he had already taken measures to strengthen the estate's security. Yet beneath his composed tone, Celia sensed an undercurrent of tension, something like concealed concern, sharp and restrained. She wondered whether he regretted involving himself so deeply in her circumstances, or whether the threat Brantham posed weighed more heavily than he wished to admit. The Duke was not a man prone to revealing emotion, but every so often Celia caught a fractional shift in his posture or a fleeting shadow in his expression that suggested he carried far more worry than he allowed to surface. When she quietly asked why he had chosen to intervene when so many others had looked away, his gaze flicked to her with a brief, unreadable intensity before he replied that he could not ignore injustice when it stood before him. It was an answer meant to satisfy without revealing too much. After he left her to rest, Celia sank onto the edge of the bed, letting the vast silence of Graymoor wrap around her like an unfamiliar cloak. She felt safer than she had in months, undeniably so, yet this safety came bound to a new uncertainty, one shaped by a man whose actions defied explanation and whose presence stirred a mixture of gratitude, confusion, and something she dared not name. As she lay back against the pillows, exhaustion overtaking her, she realized she had stepped into a world ruled by forces far larger than her own, and the Duke who now protected her was a man she barely knew, but could not help wanting to understand. The next morning unfolded with a quiet that felt almost too careful, as though Graymoor Hall itself understood the precariousness of Celia's presence within its walls, and when she stepped into the corridor, she sensed immediately that the household had been instructed to treat her with a level of deference usually reserved for nobility. Servants greeted her with soft nods, their movements gentle but watchful, and though she appreciated their kindness, it only emphasized how foreign her existence had become. Yet the greatest contrast lay with Aldric, who maintained a distance so precise it felt almost deliberate, a measured withdrawal that left her simultaneously grateful for the space and unsettled by its chill. He appeared briefly at breakfast, offering a polite greeting before retreating behind a wall of controlled formality, speaking to her only when necessity required it. Celia found herself studying him through the corner of her gaze, the rigid way he held his shoulders, the way he kept his hands clasped behind his back, the way his replies were shaped by discipline rather than ease, and she wondered whether she had misinterpreted everything she thought she sensed the day before. As the hours passed, she became increasingly aware that Aldric was watching her not with indifference but with a restraint so fierce it bordered on tension. Whenever she moved through the hall, he seemed to appear before she could drift too far, redirecting guards, adjusting patrol routes, issuing orders in low tones that revealed an urgency he tried hard to conceal. The contrast was disorienting. His body remained distant, but his actions formed a protective circle around her so subtly woven she did not notice its full shape until midday, when a maid discreetly informed her that the Duke had doubled security after receiving word that Brantham had approached local officials in fury. Celia felt a tremor of fear, but it was swiftly followed by an unexpected warmth, an awareness that Aldric's emotional distance had nothing to do with apathy and everything to do with caution, perhaps even conflict. When she encountered him later in the gallery, Celia gathered her courage and attempted a gentle question, asking whether something had displeased him, whether her presence had created complications he had not foreseen. Aldric paused, his expression unreadably composed as he replied that nothing was wrong, that protecting her was his responsibility until the law could be enacted properly. But his voice carried a faint roughness that hinted at truths he refused to speak, and the distance he tried so hard to impose between them flickered for a brief moment, revealing a glimmer of strain, an inner battle she could not yet decipher. Celia wished she could ask him more, but propriety, uncertainty, and a budding awareness of her own feelings held her silent. As evening settled across Graymoor, she found herself standing by her window, watching the guards patrol the grounds with renewed vigilance. She understood then that Aldric's distance was not a dismissal but a barrier he believed necessary, a line he feared crossing. Yet that knowledge did nothing to still the longing that stirred quietly inside her, a longing shaped not by gratitude alone, but by a trust she had not expected to give so easily to a man who seemed determined to keep his heart out of reach. Celia had only just begun to adjust to the uneasy rhythm of life within Graymoor Hall, when the fragile sense of stability shattered with the arrival of a letter delivered not through the main post, but by a breathless guard who insisted it be placed directly into the Duke's hands. Aldric accepted it with a level of composure so controlled it bordered on icy, yet the subtle tightening of his jaw betrayed that he had already guessed the sender before breaking the seal. Celia stood nearby, uncertain whether she should retreat or remain, but Aldric's silence created a vacuum that held her in place. He unfolded the parchment, scanning its contents in a single sweeping glance. The change in his expression was slight, barely a flicker, but unmistakable, a flare of anger contained so tightly that the restraint itself became frightening. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, stripped of anything resembling softness, as he informed her that Lord Brantham had written to demand her immediate return, asserting ownership in language that made her stomach twist. Celia felt her breath catch as Aldric handed her the letter, giving her the choice to read it or refuse. She forced herself to look, each line striking her with the familiar chill of Brantham's possessive cruelty. He accused her of deceit, insisted her absence had humiliated him, and threatened retribution, not only against the Duke, but against anyone who aided her. The implication that Graymoor's household might suffer for her sake cut deeper than any earlier fear. As she read, her hands trembled, but when she lifted her gaze to Aldric, she found his attention fixed not on the letter but on her face, as though gauging each ripple of her reaction with a precision that revealed how deeply her distress affected him. He took the parchment back and folded it with deliberate calm, yet the tension radiating from him felt sharper, colder, more dangerous than anything she had yet witnessed from him. Without raising his voice, Aldric issued a series of swift commands to the nearby guards: double patrols, restrict access to the estate's western wing, confirm all staff had been vetted within the last month. His tone was crisp, absolute, and for the first time Celia realized that the Duke's control was not simply a matter of temperament, but a weapon honed to keep others safe. When he turned back to her, he softened only enough to reassure her that Brantham's threats held no weight within Graymoor's walls. Yet the promise did little to still her racing heart. Fear coiled in her chest, familiar and unwelcome, threatening to unravel every fragile thread of courage she had begun to weave since arriving here. But then Aldric stepped closer, not enough to break propriety, but enough that she felt the deliberate warmth of his presence tempering the chill Brantham's words had left behind. He told her, in a voice lower and steadier than she expected, that he would not allow harm to come to her. Something unspoken passed between them in that quiet moment, a certainty that the Duke's restraint was not emotionless distance, but a barrier protecting far more feeling than he wished her to see. And standing there with the letter still burning in her memory, Celia understood with startling clarity that Brantham's fury had done something he never intended. It had drawn her and Aldric closer, binding them with fear, defiance, and a deepening connection neither yet knew how to name. The hours that followed Brantham's letter passed with a heaviness that seeped into every corner of Graymoor Hall, leaving Celia restless and unable to quiet the thoughts swirling through her mind. She drifted through the estate in an attempt to distract herself, but no matter where she went, she felt the echo of Brantham's words clinging to her, threatening to unravel the fragile sense of safety she had begun to build. When night finally settled, draping the corridors in soft candlelight, she found herself standing before the door of the Duke's study, without fully remembering the steps that brought her there. A flicker of doubt urged her to retreat, but something steadier, something shaped by trust rather than fear, guided her hand as she tapped lightly. Aldric's voice, deep and controlled, granted permission to enter, though when Celia stepped inside, she saw immediately that his composure was more brittle than he wanted her to believe. He sat behind a large mahogany desk, papers spread before him, but his attention shifted to her with a precision that made the air between them feel charged. She hesitated, unsure where to begin, until the quiet stretched so thin it nearly broke her resolve. Then, in a voice softer than she intended, she admitted she could not endure the fear alone anymore, that every promise Brantham had ever uttered seemed to rise from the shadows to remind her how powerless she once felt. Aldric listened without interrupting, his posture rigid but his eyes steady, and though he spoke no reassurances at first, something in his silence felt like permission for her to continue. She told him of the months leading to the forced engagement, the pressure, the veiled threats, the way her world seemed to shrink with every decision Brantham made for her, and as she spoke, she felt the weight she had carried alone finally begin to ease. When Aldric responded, his voice held a rawness she had never heard from him. He confessed that he understood far more of her fear than she realized, not because he had endured Brantham's tyranny, but because he once failed someone he should have protected, someone whose memory still haunted him. The brief tremor in his voice was subtle, yet the vulnerability beneath it felt profound enough to pull at the tight seams around her heart. Celia had assumed the Duke's restraint was born of indifference, but now she saw the truth. He guarded himself with the same fierce discipline he used to guard others, afraid that letting emotions surface might impair his judgment and cost another life. The distance between them, once defined by formality, softened into something intimate and fragile. Celia stepped closer, compelled by an instinct she did not fully understand, and Aldric did not retreat. Their shared confessions hung between them like threads, woven from fear, honesty, and a deepening connection that neither of them could yet name. And as she left the study that night, her steps lighter than they had been in weeks, Celia realized that trust, true trust, had begun to take root between them in a way that could not easily be undone. The next day brought an uneasy shift in Graymoor Hall, not from danger outside its walls but from the relentless murmurs filtering in from society beyond it, for by morning the Ton had seized hold of the scandal with ruthless appetite. Celia Thornwick, rescued from her own wedding, now lived under the protection of the Duke of Graymoor. Servants tried to shield her from the gossip, speaking in hushed tones when she approached, but every whisper seemed to reach her regardless. Speculation about impropriety, accusations of manipulation, even suggestions that she had willingly abandoned Brantham for a man of higher rank. The words clung to her skin like thorns, pricking her with guilt and humiliation until she could scarcely breathe. When she passed through the halls, she imagined she felt judgment pressing against her from unseen eyes, and though the household remained respectful, Celia feared she had brought ruin not only upon herself, but upon the man who had risked so much to protect her. Aldric found her in the sunroom, her posture tense as she tried to steady her breath. Without waiting for explanation, he spoke with a calm certainty that cut through her panic. Society's opinions carried no weight here, and neither he nor his household would bow to rumor. His tone held such unyielding conviction that Celia almost believed him. Yet when she tried to speak of the harm such whispers could bring to his reputation, Aldric dismissed the concern with a quiet, almost dangerous softness, as though the idea that she might tarnish him were absurd. He told her that the tongue would always cling to scandal, that their whispers were tools of idle minds, and that his life had never been dictated by the approval of those who sought entertainment in the misfortune of others. His certainty steadied her, but she could not shake the worry that she was a burden he did not deserve to carry. As though sensing her doubt, Aldric stepped closer, not violating propriety, but narrowing the space between them enough that she felt the warmth of his presence settle like a balm against her frayed nerves. He spoke more gently then, assuring her that he had acted because justice demanded it, not because he sought reward or reputation, and certainly not because he feared society's response. Celia felt the sincerity in his voice, a quiet truth woven beneath his restraint, and she realized he truly did not care what the tongue believed. The Duke's life was governed by a moral code far stronger than gossip, and his loyalty did not waver in the face of scandal. Still, the rumors persisted throughout the day, traveling through halls and letters and the restless murmurs of visiting officials. Celia found herself enduring each whisper with a mixture of shame and defiance, but each time she faltered, she remembered Aldric's words, and the steady, unwavering way he had looked at her when he spoke them. That memory became an anchor she clung to, a reminder that even in the loudest storm of judgment, she was no longer facing the world alone. And by evening, Celia sensed something inside her shift from fear toward resilience, shaped not only by Aldric's protection, but by the growing strength of her own heart. Night settled over Graymoor with a hush that seemed almost deliberate, as though the estate itself wished to soothe the turmoil that had churned through its halls all day. Yet Aldric found no peace in the quiet. He stood alone in the corridor outside Celia's suite, the dim lanterns casting long shadows along the stone walls, and though he had every intention of returning to his study, his feet refused to move. Her safety weighed on him with a gravity he had not anticipated, and he felt the press of responsibility in a way he had not felt since the day he failed someone he once vowed to protect. The memory tightened his chest, pushing him to form a promise he did not dare voice aloud. He forced himself to step away, retreating into the solitude of his chambers, where the silence echoed with the questions he had tried so hard to ignore, questions about why Celia's fear tore through him like a blade, and why her courage struck him with equal force. Celia, on the other side of the corridor, was equally awake, though her thoughts spiraled in gentler, more confused circles. She sat by the window of her suite, watching guards move steadily across the moonlit grounds, their lanterns bobbing like distant fireflies. Knowing Aldric had ordered such measures for her sake stirred something warm and trembling inside her, something she did not yet understand but could feel growing in every space fear once occupied. She replayed the day in fragments, the rumors, the cruel whispers, the quiet strength in Aldric's voice when he dismissed them all, and each memory drew her back to the moment she realized she no longer viewed him as a distant protector, but as a man whose steadiness had become the anchor she relied on. It frightened her, this shift inside her chest, but it also eased her breath in a way no reassurance ever had before. Later, when she stepped into the corridor seeking fresh air to calm her restless mind, she nearly collided with Aldric returning from his rounds. His surprise flickered only briefly before he masked it beneath his usual composed restraint. For a heartbeat they stood there, suspended in a silence neither wished to break, the distance between them seeming at once too much and too little. Aldric's gaze softened, the faintest fracture appearing in his disciplined exterior, and though he said nothing of what weighed on him, Celia sensed it, an unspoken promise, a vow forged not of duty, but of something deeper and far more dangerous. She thanked him quietly for everything he had done, and when he inclined his head in acknowledgement, the moment felt heavier than words could explain. As they parted, Aldric turned away before she could see the emotion tightening his features, and Celia returned to her room with a heart far more unsettled than before. In that quiet exchange, both understood something had changed, subtle but irrevocable, and though neither could yet name it, the truth pulsed between them with a quiet certainty. Their lives were no longer bound by circumstance alone, but by a connection already deepening beyond their control. Graymoor awoke before dawn to the sharp ring of an alarm bell, brief, muted, and immediately silenced, but unmistakable in its warning tone. Celia jolted upright, heart thundering as she strained to make sense of the sudden disruption. Within moments, the corridor outside her chamber filled with hurried footsteps and low voices, the guards speaking in clipped tones that hinted at danger they did not wish her to hear. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped out, just as Aldric appeared at the far end of the hall, his presence cutting through the chaos with the same decisive authority she had witnessed in the chapel. His gaze found her instantly, assessing, protective, and when he reached her, he spoke her name with a quiet intensity that steadied her trembling breath. He guided her back into her room before delivering the truth. A guard had intercepted an intruder attempting to breach the eastern gate under cover of darkness. Though the attempt had been thwarted, the discovery of footprints and broken brush suggested that the intruder had not acted alone. Celia felt her blood run cold at the implication, her mind leaping immediately to Brantham's threats. Aldric confirmed her fears with a curt nod, his expression hardening as he explained that the timing of the intrusion, mere hours after receiving Brantham's letter, left little doubt as to who had ordered it. Celia sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands twisting in her lap as terror surged through her, a sharp reminder that her safety within Graymoor was not impenetrable. Yet even as fear clawed at her ribs, Aldric's composure anchored her. He spoke calmly, outlining the steps he and his men were taking. Increased patrols, reinforced gate locks, expanded perimeter watches. Each detail revealed the extent of his preparation, and Celia realized he had anticipated such a move long before it occurred. When he paused, she saw something flicker across his features, a flash of anger so fierce it startled her. Not because it was directed at her, but because it revealed how personally he took the threat against her life. The restraint he usually wore like armor cracked, exposing a glimpse of the depth beneath, and Celia felt a strange shiver run through her, equal parts fear and something far more tender. She whispered an apology for being the cause of such danger, but Aldric cut the words short with a quiet finality that left no room for argument. She was not to blame, and he would not allow her to believe otherwise. His voice held a steadiness shaped by conviction rather than duty, and Celia felt the truth of it settle inside her like warmth amid the cold. As the sun rose and the household stirred with unease, Celia watched Aldric move through the halls, issuing commands with sharp precision. The guards obeyed without hesitation, their respect for him palpable. And as she observed him from the shadow of a doorway, she realized something had shifted irrevocably. Fear no longer loomed as her entire world. For standing between her and danger was a man whose resolve seemed unbreakable, whose presence steadied her breath even when her pulse raced, and whose heart, though locked behind walls, betrayed its investment with every protective step he took. Sleep eluded Celia long after the alarms faded, and the estate returned to uneasy silence. For every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shadow of an intruder slipping through the darkness, imagined Brantham's cold voice echoing through the corridors, and felt the suffocating weight of the fear she had tried so desperately to outrun. Near midnight, unable to bear the restless trembling any longer, she slipped from her room and wandered through Graymoor's dimly lit halls until she reached the drawing room where low embers still glowed in the hearth. She stepped inside quietly, expecting solitude, only to find Aldric seated in a high-backed chair, his elbows braced on his knees and his head bowed in a posture that made her pause. He looked less like a duke and more like a man carrying burdens too heavy for rest, and when he lifted his gaze to hers, she saw a stark exhaustion shining beneath the hard lines of his restraint. He stood quickly, as though startled by her presence, but she shook her head and stepped further into the room, drawn by a need she did not fully understand. The silence stretched between them before she gathered the courage to speak, her voice trembling with the confession she had been holding tightly inside her chest since the moment the guard reported the intrusion. She admitted she was terrified of Brantham, of the unknown, of the idea that at any moment her brief safety could shatter again. She told him she had tried to be strong, tried to believe she was not a burden, but fear had woven itself too deeply into her bones for her to quiet it alone. The words poured out of her in a fragile stream she could not contain, each syllable aching with vulnerability she had never revealed to anyone before. Aldric did not interrupt. He listened with a stillness so profound it felt like protection in itself, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that held not judgment but a quiet sorrow. When she finally fell silent, breath unsteady, he crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps and stopped only a few feet from her, close enough for the warmth of the firelight to cast soft shadows across his features. His voice, when he spoke, was low and edged with something rawer than she had ever heard. He told her that fear did not diminish her strength, that her courage was not measured by the absence of terror, but by her endurance in the face of it. He admitted, with hesitation that carried the weight of confession, that he had feared for her in a way he had not feared for anyone in years, and that the thought of failing her had gripped him with a force he had not expected. Celia felt her breath catch as she saw vulnerability flicker through him, a momentary crack in the armor he wore so firmly. The intimacy of his honesty drew her toward him, not with boldness, but with quiet understanding, and though neither of them bridged the final distance between them, the space felt charged with something deepening, binding, inevitable. When she finally returned to her chamber, her fear had not vanished, but it had softened beneath the steady warmth of Aldric's words, and she carried with her the fragile certainty that she was no longer facing her nightmares alone. Morning brought no peace to Graymoor, for the estate hummed with a subdued vigilance that made every footstep echo with sharper purpose, and when Aldric summoned Celia to his study, she sensed even before entering that something grim awaited her. He stood behind his desk with documents spread before him, the faint scowl etched between his brows, betraying a level of tension he rarely allowed others to see. As she approached, he lifted his gaze, and though his expression remained composed, she sensed a storm tightening beneath the surface. He explained that his investigators, men loyal to him, men who had risked much to uncover Brantham's dealings, had returned with definitive proof that the attempted intrusion was only the beginning of a broader effort to reclaim her. Payments had been traced to mercenaries operating in the outskirts of the district, coded messages intercepted that discussed retrieval, and statements collected from individuals who had long feared speaking against Brantham. Celia felt a cold tremor spread through her, the words slipping into her chest with the weight of inevitability. Her instinct was to apologize, to say she should never have come to Graymoor, that she should have endured her fate alone rather than draw danger toward those who protected her. But Aldric silenced that impulse before it could take root, his voice firm with conviction as he reminded her that the blame belonged solely to Brantham. There was no softness in his tone this time, only the cutting clarity of a man unwilling to tolerate injustice. He showed her a ledger recovered from one of Brantham's associates, the list of names, the sums paid, the dates that aligned far too neatly with the days she had tried to resist her engagement. Celia stared at the ink on the page, bile rising in her throat, as she realized just how systematically Brantham had orchestrated her capture. Yet amid her rising fear, she noticed something else. Aldric was including her in the discussion, not sheltering her from the details as though she were fragile porcelain. He spoke to her as someone capable of understanding, someone whose perspective mattered. The shift stirred something warm within her, an affirmation that she was no longer powerless. Her voice shook when she asked what would happen next, but the question held more strength than she expected. Aldric stepped closer, resting a hand on the desk as he explained their plan to gather enough evidence to bring Brantham before the courts. He told her he intended to see justice done not only for her but for those who had suffered before her. The sincerity in his voice steadied her trembling heart. For the first time since the nightmare began, Celia felt a spark of resolve kindle beneath the fear. She realized she was no longer facing her enemy alone. She had an ally who fought with both discipline and quiet fury, a man who bore her safety like a vow. And as she stood there beside Aldric, reading the proof of the threat against her, something inside her shifted. Fear began to give way to determination, shaped by the strength of the man who refused to let her fall. The revelations of the morning lingered over Celia like a dark fog, yet beneath the heaviness she felt a strange new resolve forming, fragile still, but present in a way it had never been before. Aldric seemed to recognize the shift in her, for after their discussion he suggested they move to one of Graymoor's interior courtyards, a secluded space shielded by high stone walls and softened by climbing ivy. She followed him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, uncertain why he had brought her there until he removed his gloves and positioned himself opposite her, explaining in a quiet, unwavering tone that he intended to teach her how to defend herself. The notion startled her. She had never imagined a life where self-protection was possible, let alone necessary. But the sincerity in Aldric's eyes and the memory of Brantham's threats broke through her hesitation. She nodded, breath unsteady but determined. What followed was a lesson far gentler than she expected. Aldric guided her through basic stances, showing her where to place her feet, how to ground her balance, how to shift her weight so she would not topple at the slightest force. His instructions were calm and measured, never rushed, and though his proximity set her pulse trembling, he never touched her without warning, offering his hands only when she allowed him to adjust her posture. The first time he stepped behind her to correct the angle of her shoulders, Celia felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from the awareness of how carefully he moved around her, as if she were both breakable and capable, someone he wished to strengthen rather than simply preserve. She tried each movement with earnest focus, though her limbs trembled with unfamiliarity, and when she faltered, Aldric offered steady encouragement rather than critique. He reminded her that strength was not a single moment of bravery but a series of choices, small, persistent decisions to stand even when fear urged retreat. The words lodged themselves inside her, warming a part of her heart she had long kept shuttered. As the lesson continued, her confidence grew in soft increments. She learned how to brace herself, how to redirect momentum, how to recognize the subtle cues of danger before it struck. Each skill, however small, felt like reclaiming a fragment of the power she had lost. But more profound than the techniques themselves was the way Aldric regarded her, not as a burden he was obligated to protect, nor as a fragile soul destined to shatter, but as a woman with a will capable of rising above her terror. His respect radiated through every instruction, every patient correction, every quiet word that carried the weight of belief. When they finally paused, breath mingling in the cool courtyard air, Celia realized her heart ached, not from exertion, but from the intensity of being seen, truly seen, in a way she never had before. And as Aldric stepped back, his gaze lingering with something unspoken and deeply warm, she felt the unmistakable truth settling between them like a fragile promise. The lessons he offered her were not merely for protection, they were an invitation to reclaim her life, and perhaps, in time, her courage to love. The invitation arrived that afternoon, an elegant cream card bearing the crest of the Ashford family, summoning Aldric to a gathering hosted by one of the few households powerful enough to command his presence. Though Celia hoped the Duke would decline, he insisted they attend, explaining that withdrawing from society now would only strengthen Brantham's narrative and paint her as a fugitive rather than a victim under his protection. The prospect turned her stomach with dread, but the conviction in Aldric's voice steadied her resolve, and that evening she found herself stepping into a glittering ballroom awash with golden light and murmuring speculation. Conversations faltered the moment she entered at the Duke's side, dozens of eyes sliding toward her with thinly veiled curiosity, judgment, or fascination. Celia tried to remain composed, but her pulse fluttered violently beneath the weight of their scrutiny. Aldric's presence beside her offered some solace. He moved with quiet authority, refusing to allow the crowd's whispers to dictate his steps. For a brief moment, the evening proceeded without disaster. Celia found her breath in small increments, reassured by Aldric's calm responses to those who greeted them with stiff politeness. But as she scanned the room, her gaze collided with a pair of cold, predatory eyes positioned near one of the marble columns. Eyes she knew too well, eyes that froze her blood. Lord Brantham stood at the edge of the crowd, his presence a silent threat despite the careful civility etched into his features. Celia halted mid-step, every muscle winding tight as memory and terror surged together. The ballroom's polished floor seemed to tilt beneath her, and she might have collapsed had Aldric not immediately registered the sudden stillness in her posture. Without hesitation, he stepped closer, angling his body protectively between her and the man she feared. Brantham's lips curled in a ghost of a smile, polite enough to avoid scandal, malicious enough to communicate precisely how little he cared for appearances. Aldric's voice, low and edged with cold fury, cut through the distance as he warned Brantham to step back, invoking investigations and legal consequences with a sharpness that silenced nearby conversations. Brantham replied with a quiet, venomous murmur that only hardened Aldric's stance, and in that moment Celia realized she had never truly seen the Duke angered. Not like this, not with a fury honed not by ego but by fierce, restrained protectiveness. The crowd sensed tension rippling through the air, and whispers spread like wildfire, but Aldric did not waver. His entire focus remained fixed on shielding her, his posture a living barrier that no one dared challenge. For Celia, the moment was a collision of fear and revelation. Even as her hands trembled, she felt a surge of awe at the depth of his resolve. He was not defending her reputation, nor merely fulfilling a duty. He was shielding her with a devotion that transcended obligation. When Brantham finally retreated with a smug threat disguised as politeness, Celia found herself clutching Aldric's sleeve, breath unsteady. He turned to her with a softness he had not shown all evening, asking if she wished to leave. And as she nodded, unable to speak, she understood with startling clarity that her world had begun shifting in ways neither of them could ignore, ways shaped not only by fear, but by a bond deepening with every act of defiance he made on her behalf. The carriage ride back to Graymoor passed in a strained, fragile silence that Celia could not quite endure, for though Aldric sat beside her with the same rigid composure he had maintained throughout the ballroom confrontation, she could feel the tautness in his posture, as though it were a physical force pressing against the dimly lit space. She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, ashamed of how her body had betrayed her the moment she saw Brantham, how she had frozen, breath caught halfway in her throat, unable to do anything but tremble, while Aldric bore the weight of her fear. Even now her heart thudded unevenly, replaying the cold satisfaction in Brantham's gaze, the vile promise hidden behind the polite curve of his smile. When the carriage pulled through Graymoor's gates at last, the Duke waited for her to descend first, offering his hand, not out of courtesy, but because he sensed she needed the grounding touch. She accepted it, though the warmth of his palm only unraveled her further, reminding her how different she felt in his presence, protected, steadied, yet painfully aware of the weakness she feared he had witnessed too clearly. Inside the hall, servants withdrew discreetly, leaving them alone in the lantern-lit corridor. Celia attempted to speak, to apologize for freezing and forcing him to confront Brantham while she stood powerless, but the words tangled in her throat. Aldric turned toward her slowly, and the look in his eyes startled her, not frustration, not disappointment, but something deep and steady, a quiet intensity that softened the tightness winding through her chest. He told her she had nothing to apologize for, that fear did not signify frailty, that her reaction was not a failure, but a natural response to a danger she had endured alone for far too long. His voice carried no judgment, only understanding, and the unexpected compassion in his tone broke something inside her that had been braced for reproach. Celia felt tears sting her eyes, hot and unwelcome, and she tried to turn away, embarrassed by how easily her composure slipped. But Aldric stepped closer, not touching her, yet near enough that his presence felt like a shield, and told her that strength was not the absence of trembling but the courage to keep moving despite it. His words, simple yet profound, sank into her like sunlight piercing a storm, and for the first time since the ballroom incident, she felt her breath deepen, easing the ache in her ribs. Their silence stretched, no longer strained, but laden with something unspoken, and Celia sensed the air shift between them, fragile and warm. Aldric hesitated then, as though torn between propriety and the instinct to offer more comfort than would be deemed appropriate. Ultimately, he stepped back, restoring the boundary he clung to with disciplined restraint, yet the brief flicker of longing in his eyes lingered in the quiet space between them. Celia watched him walk away, the echo of his words pulsing through her chest, and realized she was no longer ashamed of how she had faltered, because he had seen her trembling and had not turned from her but toward her, with a steadiness that felt dangerously close to devotion. Graymoor lay quiet beneath a muted morning sky, the estate wrapped in a hush that felt almost contemplative. Yet beneath that calm, Celia sensed something in Aldric had shifted since the ballroom incident. He appeared more distant than ever, not cold, but careful, moving through the corridors with a deliberation that suggested he was wrestling with thoughts he did not intend to share. When she found him in the library, standing before a tall window with the early light outlining the rigid set of his shoulders, she hesitated at the threshold, unsure whether she should intrude. But as if sensing her presence, he turned, and the faint exhaustion shadowing his features made the decision for her. She stepped inside. He tried at first to maintain his usual formality, offering polite inquiry about her rest, but his voice caught slightly on the final word, betraying the strain tightening his composure. Celia moved closer, emboldened by a quiet intuition that the distance he placed between them was not meant to keep her away but to keep something inside himself contained. She asked gently, softly enough that he could ignore the question, if he wished, whether the confrontation with Brantham had unsettled him in ways he had not spoken of. For a moment, he held her gaze without responding, his jaw clenched as though struggling against an answer. Then, with a long breath that sounded less like surrender and more like necessity, he set aside the veneer of the Duke and allowed the man beneath to surface. He told her of a young woman, a distant cousin, spirited and trusting, who had once come to him for protection against a suitor whose intentions he underestimated. Aldric had believed he could control the situation, that his influence alone would be enough to keep danger at bay. But one night, While he delayed action in hopes of gathering more evidence, the suitor acted first. The loss carved a wound so deep Aldric had carried it for years, and though justice was eventually served, it had done nothing to quiet the guilt. As he spoke, his voice remained remarkably steady, but the emotion threaded beneath each word was unmistakable, a grief sharpened into resolve, a vow forged from failure. Celia listened in stunned, aching silence. She had never imagined Aldric capable of such vulnerability, never imagined he bore a private sorrow that shaped every decision he made. Understanding dawned with quiet clarity. His protectiveness toward her was not rooted in duty alone, but in a desperate determination never to repeat the past. Her heart tightened with empathy, not pity, and she stepped closer, not touching him, but offering the closeness he had denied himself for so long. She told him softly that he did not fail her, that his efforts had given countless others a shield against injustice, and that his guilt did not define the man she saw before her. Aldric's gaze flickered, something raw and grateful passing through it before he turned away to steady himself. In that moment, Celia realized their bond had deepened irrevocably, not through fear or circumstance, but through truth shared in a room where neither could pretend to be anything other than human. The days following Aldric's confession unfolded differently, touched by a quiet transformation that Celia felt not only within herself, but in the way the household began to regard her. Whereas she had once moved through Graymoor like a shadow, unsure of her place, she now walked with purpose, her steps steadier, her breath no longer dictated by the constant squeeze of fear. Aldric's lessons, his belief in her resilience, and the truth he had shared in the library had awakened something inside her, a strength that had always been there, but had never been given air enough to thrive. She rose each morning with a determination to reclaim the pieces of her life Brantham had tried to steal, and she practiced the stances Aldric had shown her in the courtyard, repeating them until they felt less like borrowed movements and more like extensions of her own will. Servants passing through the corridors paused with soft smiles as they watched her. They seemed to recognize the shift as well, offering quiet encouragement without intruding on her privacy. Celia had never imagined she would find comfort in belonging, even tentatively, to a household. Yet Graymoor began to feel less like a fortress she hid within, and more like a place where she could breathe without bracing for harm. When Aldric observed her from across a room, or pretended not to while she caught glimpses of him, Celia felt a warmth move through her that was no longer tangled with fear, but with a budding confidence shaped by his respect. One afternoon, she sought him out in the eastern hall, eager to share a newfound clarity she could scarcely articulate. She admitted that for the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt capable of directing her own fate. Aldric listened intently, his expression softening in ways he rarely allowed, and the intensity of his gaze made her pulse quicken. He told her she had always possessed strength, she had simply never been permitted to use it. His words settled inside her like truth she had been waiting to hear her entire life. The exchange, though brief, carried a tenderness that neither dared acknowledge aloud, but its effect was undeniable. The distance between them, once shaped by circumstance and caution, now pulsed with something warm, fragile, and alive. That evening, as Celia practiced alone in the courtyard, Aldric watched from the archway, arms crossed, his eyes following each steady movement with a look she could not decipher. To him, her resolve was more stirring than any demonstration of skill. He saw in her the woman she was becoming, one crafted not by fear, but by quiet courage. And though he told himself he must remain distant, must not allow emotion to compromise judgment, the truth tugged relentlessly at the edges of his restraint. Celia Thornwick was no longer merely under his protection, she was becoming essential to the man he was, and the man he feared he might yet become. Twilight draped Graymoor in a muted glow, the fading gold of the sky bleeding softly into the lanterns that flickered to life along the stone passageways, and Celia felt the entire estate settling into a hush that made every sound, every footstep, every breath, echo more intimately. She had spent the afternoon practicing the movements Aldric had taught her, and though her limbs ached with unfamiliar exertion, her heart felt lighter than it had in days. When she stepped into one of the quieter corridors, intending to retire early, she found Aldric standing near a tall arched window, his silhouette carved against the dusky light. The sight drew her still, for there was something vulnerable in the way he stared into the distance, as though contemplating a truth he could not speak aloud. He turned when he sensed her presence, his expression shifting from introspection to something softer, something that made her pulse quicken. She approached him cautiously, unsure whether she should disturb what appeared to be a rare moment of unguarded reflection. But Aldric stepped forward, as though drawn toward her, despite himself. He asked about her practice, his tone gentle, in a way that felt almost foreign for a man so accustomed to restraint. She replied shyly, admitting she felt stronger, not merely in body but in spirit. He watched her with an intensity that made her breath falter, the subtle curve of pride softening the stern lines of his face. Their conversation drifted into a silence that held none of the stiffness it once did. Instead, it pulsed with something warm and unspoken. When Celia thanked him, truly thanked him, for giving her back the sense of power she thought she had lost forever, Aldric inhaled sharply, as though the sincerity of her gratitude pierced armor he had long assumed impenetrable. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that the space between them trembled with possibility. Celia's heart pounded wildly, her breath shallow, her emotions tangled in a longing she had tried to ignore but could no longer deny. Aldric lifted a hand as though intending to brush a stray curl from her cheek, and she leaned toward him instinctively, her body moving before she could think to restrain it. His fingers hovered inches from her skin, the heat of him sending a shiver down her spine, and for a moment, the world narrowed to that fragile space where breath touched breath and silence felt like a trembling thread, ready to snap. Her lips parted ever so slightly, inviting what she had no right to expect, and Aldric, with a quiet sound that carried both hunger and anguish, abruptly withdrew his hand. He stepped back as though the proximity burned him, his breath uneven, his jaw clenched in a torment she could not decipher. He whispered her name, filled with longing and apology, before forcing space between them. Celia's heart tightened painfully, but beneath the ache lay something unmistakable. He had wanted to kiss her, deeply, desperately. He had held himself back not from lack of feeling, but because he feared crossing a boundary while she remained under his protection. As he turned away, struggling to gather his composure, Celia pressed a hand to her chest, her pulse fluttering wildly, and understood that their lives had reached a precipice, one where desire stirred beneath every breath. Yet neither knew how to step forward without risking everything they had fought to build. The morning after their almost kiss dawned with a tension that clung to Graymoor like a heavy mist, thickening the halls with an unspoken awareness neither Celia nor Aldric could quite dispel. Celia moved through the estate in a daze, replaying the moment when Aldric's hand had hovered near her cheek, the breath they had shared, the longing she had felt rising in her chest, like a tide she was powerless to stop. Yet woven into that memory was the sharp sting of his withdrawal, a reminder that whatever pulsed between them remained bound by circumstances neither could ethically ignore. She tried to steady her racing heart, telling herself that gratitude, not desire, should guide her thoughts. But each time she recalled the anguish flickering in Aldric's eyes as he stepped away, her resolve fractured. A guard interrupted her restless wandering shortly before midday, delivering a sealed message that bore the unmistakable crest of Brantham's family. Celia's blood chilled before she even accepted the parchment. She carried it to Aldric's study, her steps quickening with dread, and found him already deep in conversation with two of his men. The moment he saw the letter in her hands, his expression hardened with a coldness she had learned to recognize as the Duke's shield against fury. He dismissed the guards and took the message, scanning it with a composure so tightly held it seemed carved from granite. But Celia saw the truth in the slight tremor of his jaw, the way his breath sharpened beneath the surface. Brantham's ultimatum was succinct and vicious. He demanded Celia's immediate return, threatening to unleash a wave of political ruin upon Graymoor and anyone associated with the Duke. He implied he had influence enough to destroy reputations, to manipulate legal proceedings, to turn the tongue against Aldric with rumors crafted to appear as truth. And beneath those threats lay a darker promise, that if Celia did not come willingly, he would reclaim her by force before Graymoor could hide her behind its walls. The word sent a tremor through her, the old suffocating fear coiling back around her ribs, but before it could settle, Aldric tore the letter in half with a controlled ferocity that made her flinch. He told her in a voice low and unwavering that Brantham's threats were the desperate grasps of a man whose power was slipping, and that no amount of manipulation would compel him to surrender her. But Celia saw the danger etched in the tightness of his stance, in the shadows beneath his eyes, and she sensed the silent vow forming behind his restraint. He would protect her even if it meant placing himself, and perhaps everything he owned, directly in Brantham's line of attack. The realization struck her with both awe and terror, for she knew the Duke's resolve carried a cost he refused to speak aloud. As Aldric stepped closer, his voice softened into something perilously close to tenderness. He promised she would not face the threat alone. And though fear lingered at the edge of her breath, Celia felt an undeniable warmth settle in her chest. For the first time in her life, someone was willing to stand between her and the storm, not out of obligation, but because losing her was a possibility he could not bear. The tension lingering after Brantham's ultimatum settled over Graymoor like a tightening net, yet beneath the fear Celia felt something else stirring, something sharper, steadier, a resolve she scarcely recognized as her own. She spent the early hours pacing her chamber, replaying Aldric's vow and the cold threat woven through Brantham's words, and gradually a truth crystallized with startling clarity. She could no longer allow others to fight on her behalf, while she remained hidden behind locked doors. She had spent too many months being maneuvered like a silent pawn, too many nights frozen beneath fear's crushing weight. Now, with danger closing in from every side, she understood that survival demanded more than protection. It demanded choice, voice, and courage. When she found Aldric in the war room, hunched over maps and reports with two of his most trusted men, she felt her heart thrum with both dread and determination. He dismissed the men at her approach, his expression tightening with concern when he saw the resolve in her eyes. Before he could speak, she told him plainly, though her voice trembled, that she wished to stand with him in whatever actions must follow. She insisted she would not hide while Brantham threatened the lives of those who protected her, nor would she remain a passive symbol in a battle that involved her more intimately than anyone else. Aldric listened, the hard lines of his face softening with something between admiration and apprehension. He warned her of the risks, his voice low and strained, reminding her that Brantham was ruthless, that legal counsels could be unforgiving, that public scrutiny could wound a person far more deeply than any blade. But Celia held her ground. She told him she understood the danger, that she was afraid, so afraid, but that the fear no longer paralyzed her. Aldric's jaw tightened, his breath catching almost imperceptibly, and for a fleeting moment she thought he might refuse her outright. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a rough whisper as he confessed that he was torn between the need to shield her and the respect he felt for her courage. The tension in the air felt almost palpable, charged with unspoken emotions neither dared release. After a long silence, he inclined his head, granting her request with the reluctant grace of a man who knew he could not deny her agency without betraying the trust that had formed between them. He explained the next steps, gathering testimonies, assembling evidence, preparing for the council that would review Brantham's crimes. Celia listened intently, absorbing each detail, her fear now interwoven with determination. For the first time since her nightmare began, she felt not like prey hunted by circumstance, but like a woman reclaiming control of her destiny. Aldric's gaze lingered on her with quiet reverence, as though seeing her anew, and she felt warmth bloom in her chest at the realization that he believed in her, not as someone fragile, but as someone formidable. In choosing to stand beside him, she understood she had changed the shape of her future. And though uncertainty loomed like storm clouds beyond Graymoor's walls, Celia felt ready to face it, because she was no longer facing it alone. The next morning dawned with a clarity that seemed almost at odds with the tension swirling through Graymoor, and Celia sensed the change the moment she entered Aldric's study. Maps, documents, testimonies, and coded letters lay arranged across the tables in meticulous order, forming a labyrinth of truth Aldric and his men had painstakingly unraveled over the past weeks. Today, though, he beckoned her closer, inviting her into the space as an equal rather than a protected guest. Celia approached with hesitant steps, her pulse quickening as she realized the magnitude of the task before them, not only uncovering Brantham's schemes, but presenting them in a way that the council could not ignore. Aldric's gaze softened when she reached his side, and he explained the significance of each piece of evidence: ledgers recording illicit payments to mercenaries, letters revealing coercive tactics, sworn statements from families pressured into silence, and coded notes referencing her by initial alone, as though she were nothing more than an item in a transaction. As she read, a tightness formed in her chest, not solely from fear but from a simmering anger she had not known she was capable of feeling. For months she had believed she was alone in her suffering, trapped in a nightmare crafted for her alone. Yet here was proof that Brantham had woven such cruelty into a pattern, exploiting vulnerability for personal gain. Celia lifted her eyes to Aldric, and he watched her with unmistakable respect, as though witnessing not her distress but her growing strength. He asked her to review the letters addressed to her father, documents she had never been allowed to see. The first line alone made her breath stutter. Brantham had promised wealth in exchange for obedience, offering influence and security, while casually noting that sentiment is of no concern where the girl is involved. The words struck her like a blow. She steadied herself against the edge of the desk, unwilling to allow trembling to undermine the resolve she had claimed. Aldric stepped closer, not touching her but standing near enough that his presence offered unspoken steadiness. He guided her through interpreting the documents, his voice low and measured, and Celia found herself absorbing the information not with despair, but with a clarity that sharpened her determination. She began pointing out discrepancies, identifying dates that aligned with her father's sudden change in behavior, and offering insights only she could see, details of conversations, subtle threats, lingering silences that now snapped into place like pieces of a puzzle. Aldric watched her quietly as she analyzed the documents, pride glimmering beneath his composed exterior. He had always known she possessed strength, but seeing her claim it, wield it, moved him in a way he had not anticipated. Their hands brushed when they both reached for the same page, and though the contact lasted only a heartbeat, it sent a soft, startling warmth through her. She withdrew quickly, cheeks warming, yet Aldric's eyes held hers with an intensity that suggested the moment had not gone unnoticed. By the time they finished, the room felt transformed, not because the evidence had changed, but because Celia had. She was no longer simply the victim Brantham had sought to silence. She had become a witness, a strategist, a participant in the pursuit of justice. And Aldric, standing beside her, seemed to feel the same truth settling between them. Together, they had become far more powerful than either had been alone. Evening descended upon Graymoor with an unusual stillness, a quiet so deep it felt as though the estate itself were holding its breath. Celia sensed the unease lingering beneath the surface, guards speaking in low voices, servants moving with urgent purpose, Aldric remaining tense in ways he attempted to conceal. The evidence they had gathered over the past days had been powerful, damning, and Brantham, cornered by its weight, had grown increasingly unpredictable. Celia tried to steady her thoughts as she walked through the main hall, her mind focused on preparing for the council hearing, but an unsettled feeling tugged at her with every echo of her footsteps. She paused at a window overlooking the darkened grounds, her breath catching at the faintest movement near the outer wall, a flicker too deliberate to be wind. Before she could call out, the crash of splintering wood shattered the fragile calm. Graymoor erupted into chaos as armed men surged through a breached side entrance, faces shadowed and movements swift with practiced precision. Celia froze for a heartbeat, terror gripping her limbs as memories of Brantham's threats surged forward, but the echo of Aldric's lessons pierced the panic. She forced herself to move, to think, to breathe. Guards rushed to meet the intruders in a clash of steel and desperate shouts, and Celia stumbled backward into an alcove just as a young footman cried out, cornered by one of the attackers wielding a raised blade. Her body reacted before her mind caught up. Celia darted forward, grabbing the footman's arm and pulling him away with a strength born of instinct rather than training. The attacker turned toward her with a snarl, and though fear surged through her, she braced herself exactly as Aldric had taught her, feet grounded, weight centered, breath steady. Her heart hammered wildly, but she did not collapse this time. She held her ground until one of Aldric's guards tackled the man, knocking him to the floor. Across the hall, Aldric appeared like a force unleashed, his movements sharp and controlled as he fought through the intruders with a ferocity she had never witnessed. He barked orders, directing his men with seamless precision, but when his gaze found her, standing trembling yet unbroken, something flickered across his face, a mixture of pride and terror that tightened her throat. She wanted to run to him, to assure him she was unharmed, but another wave of attackers surged forward, drawing his focus back to battle. The fight was swift, but brutal. Within minutes, Graymoor's guards subdued the remaining intruders, and the hall fell into a heavy silence broken only by ragged breaths and the clatter of discarded weapons. When Aldric finally reached her, his hands gripped her shoulders with a trembling intensity that betrayed the composure he fought to maintain. He asked if she was hurt, his voice roughened by fear, and Celia shook her head, tears stinging her eyes as she tried to speak, but words failed her. In that moment, surrounded by wreckage and shadows, she saw with aching clarity what he could not bring himself to confess, that the thought of losing her had shaken him in a way nothing else ever had. And as Aldric drew her into the shelter of his arms, the air between them filled with a truth too powerful to ignore. Whatever bound them now reached far beyond duty and neither of them could pretend otherwise any longer. After the intruders were disarmed and carried away for questioning, Graymoor descended into a shaken hush broken only by the hurried footsteps of guards reinforcing every entrance. Celia felt the trembling in her limbs intensify as the shock settled into her bones, yet nothing unsettled her as deeply as the look in Aldric's eyes when he ushered her into the safety of a smaller drawing room. He closed the door behind them with slow, deliberate force, his breath uneven, his posture rigid, as though containing an emotion too powerful to be allowed free. She stood near the hearth, the firelight flickering over her hands as she tried to steady them, but the moment Aldric turned toward her, the depth of what he felt washed through the room like a storm about to break. He crossed the space between them in a few long strides, but stopped short of touching her, gripping the back of a chair so tightly his knuckles whitened. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and strained, carrying the weight of a man who had just faced the prospect of losing something he had not yet permitted himself to claim. He asked whether she understood what had almost happened, how close she had come to harm, how the sight of her standing amid danger had struck him with a fear he had spent years convincing himself he was immune to. His control slipped with each word until the raw edge beneath it surfaced fully, revealing a torment he could no longer hide. Celia felt her heart tighten, not from fear but from the overwhelming tenderness she heard in the cracks of his restraint. She approached slowly, her steps soft across the rug, and when she spoke, her voice trembled with the truth she had carried quietly for days, that she knew how close the danger was, that she had felt it too, but she could not simply stand aside and wait for others to shield her. It was her life Brantham sought to reclaim. She refused to surrender it silently any longer. Aldric's eyes closed briefly, as though her words struck him with equal parts pride and agony. When he opened them, what she saw there nearly stole her breath. Longing so fierce it seemed to burn behind each breath he fought to control. He whispered her name, and for a moment it seemed he might seize her hand, draw her into his arms, confess everything that trembled between them. But as quickly as the impulse ignited, he forced himself back, retreating a single step as though that small distance were the only barrier preventing him from losing himself entirely. He told her, voice rough, heavy, that he could not cross the line between protector and man while she remained under his care. To do so would betray the moral code he lived by, the vow he had forged from past failure. Celia felt tears prick at her eyes, not from hurt but from the depth of emotion he struggled so fiercely to contain. She understood then what his restraint truly was, not rejection, but devotion honed into discipline. And though no confession passed his lips, she felt the truth thrum between them like a heartbeat. He cared for her far more than propriety allowed. When Aldric finally stepped aside, offering her a path toward the door, she lingered, unable to move, her own heart trembling with a mixture of longing and grief. They stood suspended in that fragile silence, neither daring to step closer nor walk away, and the truth settled upon them with quiet, devastating clarity. Love had already taken root, but neither yet knew how to reach for it without breaking. Graymoor bustled with tense preparation the following morning, for the council hearing, long delayed by Brantham's influence, was finally convening under pressure from evidence. Aldric's men had gathered and testimonies Celia had helped piece together. She dressed with trembling hands, not from fear of Brantham alone but from the enormity of what she was about to do, speak publicly of the cruelty she had endured, expose a man who had built his life upon intimidation and silence, and reclaim the voice he had spent months trying to crush. Aldric met her at the foot of the staircase, dressed in severe black, every line of his posture carved with determination. His eyes, however, softened the moment they found hers, and though he offered no inappropriate touch, the steadiness in his gaze was a comfort more powerful than any embrace. The council chamber was filled to its brim with officials, witnesses, and members of the ton hungry for spectacle. Whispers rippled through the room as she entered, some sympathetic, others sharp with judgment, but Celia held Aldric's earlier words close to her heart. Strength was not the absence of fear, but the choice to stand despite it. When Brantham appeared, escorted by guards, the air shifted sharply. His gaze locked on her with a venom masked behind a smile, so polished it chilled her. For a heartbeat, the fear surged again, threatening to steal her breath, but then Aldric took his place beside her, the quiet force of his presence reminding her she was no longer facing this alone. When her moment came, Celia stepped forward with more steadiness than she thought possible. Her voice wavered at first as she recounted the circumstances of her forced engagement, her father's debts twisted into leverage, the veiled threats disguised as courtship, and the way Brantham had stripped her of choice, with every carefully crafted lie. But as she spoke, the trembling faded. She described the infiltration attempts, the documents Aldric had uncovered, the coded letters referencing her as if she were property rather than a human being, and with each word her confidence grew. The chamber fell into a tense silence, every ear fixed upon her testimony. Even the officials who had once been skeptical now leaned forward, eyes narrowing with dawning comprehension. Brantham attempted to interrupt, denying her claims with smug indignation, but the evidence Aldric presented struck each of his arguments down with devastating precision. Celia watched his composure crack, satisfaction blooming inside her, not from vengeance but from the realization that she was no longer powerless. She had become the instrument of her own liberation. When she finished speaking, the chamber erupted in murmur, this time not of scandal but of shock and sympathy. Aldric's gaze met hers across the table, and though his expression remained composed, the pride burning in his eyes warmed her to her core. As Brantham was escorted away for further questioning, his threats rendered hollow by the weight of truth, Celia felt a profound shift settle within her. She had confronted the man who once ruled her nightmares, and emerged standing, and somewhere deep in her chest, she felt the first steady breath of a future she had once believed impossible, a future shaped not by fear, but by freedom. The council adjourned at dusk, their decision postponed until the following morning, though the atmosphere in the chamber made the outcome feel all but inevitable. Officials whispered among themselves, poring over the damning evidence Aldric had laid before them, and while Celia knew victory was near, the weight of the day settled over her like a heavy cloak. She stepped out into the fading evening light, the world tinged in amber hues that softened the edges of her exhaustion. Aldric walked beside her in silence, a steady presence that guided her through the murmuring crowd. Every so often she caught fragments of conversations, praise for her courage, surprise at her composure, muttered condemnation of Brantham, but none of it felt entirely real, not yet. Her mind remained caught between the trembling wreckage of the girl she had been and the fragile, rising strength of the woman she was becoming. When they reached the carriage, Aldric offered his hand, and though she accepted it without hesitation, she felt his restraint as sharply as she felt his warmth. He helped her inside and took his seat opposite her, the air thick with words neither of them dared speak. The moment the carriage began to move, Celia exhaled shakily, the first true breath she had taken since stepping into the council hall. Aldric watched her with an expression somewhere between relief and torment, his self-control stretched thin by the day's events. She thanked him softly, her voice weak with exhaustion yet full of sincerity. Without him, she would never have stood before the council. Without him, she might have remained a silent pawn in Brantham's cruel game. Aldric's reply was quiet, almost rough. He told her that no gratitude was owed, that her strength had been her own, that she had faced Brantham with a bravery many seasoned men could not claim. The intensity in his gaze made her heart tighten, for beneath his composure she sensed the raw emotion he kept leashed with iron discipline. But even as warmth spread through her, uncertainty tugged at the edges of her thoughts. Brantham's fate was not yet sealed. His allies were powerful, his influence long-reaching, and though she had exposed him, she feared what desperation might drive him to attempt next. She voiced her fears, barely above a whisper, and Aldric leaned forward slightly, his tone steady as he vowed that whatever came, she would not face it alone. The words soothed, but did not settle fully, for Celia sensed something deeper behind them, a protective devotion he refused to name, a longing that lingered unspoken in every glance he gave her. She felt the pull of it as surely as she felt her own growing attachment, and the space between them felt charged with a dangerous tenderness neither of them knew how to navigate. She turned her gaze to the window, watching Graymoor's familiar silhouette rise in the distance, and wondered whether triumph alone was enough to steady her uncertain heart. Yet when Aldric helped her down from the carriage, his hand lingering in hers for a moment longer than propriety allowed, she knew one truth beyond doubt. Whatever tomorrow held, victory, risk, or something neither of them yet dared imagine, the bond between them had deepened too profoundly to ignore. Graymoor was quieter than usual that evening, as though the estate sensed the fragile state of the hearts within its walls. Celia retreated to her chamber with a heaviness that was not quite sorrow and not quite fear, but something tangled between relief and anticipation, a suspended breath awaiting resolution. She tried to sleep, but found her mind replaying the day's events, lingering not only on Brantham's unraveling but on Aldric's steady presence beside her, the warmth in his eyes when she spoke, the fierce protectiveness that seemed to rise from a place far deeper than duty. The truth whispered through her thoughts like a dangerous confession. She wanted him to care, and she feared he already did. A soft knock broke the silence. Startled, she opened the door to find Aldric standing in the dim corridor, the lantern behind him illuminating the tension etched into his features. He apologized for disturbing her rest but admitted he could not retire for the night until he knew whether she was truly well. Celia stepped aside without speaking, inviting him into the room, though the small space felt suddenly filled with a tenderness she did not know how to navigate. Aldric remained near the doorway, as though crossing deeper into the room might tempt him across boundaries he had vowed not to breach. He asked how she felt, whether the council proceedings had left her shaken, whether Brantham's glare still haunted her. She answered truthfully, telling him exhaustion weighed heavy, but fear no longer ruled her, thanks to the evidence, the testimonies, and the strength she had discovered in herself. As she spoke, she watched Aldric's expression soften, the tightness in his shoulders easing, and she sensed how deeply her courage affected him. Something unspoken hovered between them, a warmth that settled into the quiet like a shared heartbeat. He remained still for a long moment before confessing, in a low voice edged with vulnerability, that he had struggled to keep his composure throughout the hearing, that every time Brantham looked at her, he felt something inside him ignite with a fury he had not expected to feel again. He admitted he feared what might have happened if the attack at Graymoor had cost him her life, and the rawness of his words sent a tremor through her. Celia stepped closer, drawn by an instinct she could no longer suppress, and Aldric did not retreat this time. He stood rooted, breath unsteady, eyes fixed on hers with a longing he could no longer disguise. Their proximity crackled with restrained emotion, a delicate tension that wove itself into the silence between them. Celia whispered that she trusted him, not because he had rescued her, but because he had seen her strength before she recognized it in herself. The admittance broke something in him. She saw it in the slight tremor of his breath, the softening of his gaze. For a heartbeat, it seemed he might reach for her, might finally allow his feelings to surface fully. But then he exhaled shakily and stepped back, forcing distance between them as though the nearness alone threatened the control he fought so hard to maintain. He told her they must wait, until Brantham's fate was sealed, until her safety was unquestioned, until the power imbalance between them no longer threatened the purity of what lay growing in their hearts. Celia's chest ached at the restraint, but beneath it pulsed something undeniably hopeful. When he left her chamber, she leaned against the closed door, breath trembling, and understood that love, quiet, dangerous, impossible to ignore, had rooted itself between them, waiting only for a moment when neither fear nor circumstance could command them to turn away. Morning arrived with a thin veil of fog draped over Graymoor, the pale light filtering through Celia's curtains like a hesitant whisper. She rose before the servants knocked, her heart stirring with a blend of dread and fragile hope. Today the council would deliver its verdict, and though she felt the weight of the moment pressing against her ribs, she also sensed the new steadiness rooted within her, a strength Aldric had helped her uncover piece by piece. When she descended the stairs, she found him waiting in the entrance hall, dressed with even sharper precision than usual, though the faint tension in his jaw betrayed how fiercely he braced himself for the day ahead. Their gazes met, and no words were necessary. The promise they had carried in silence accompanied them as they stepped into the carriage. The council chamber buzzed with a restrained electricity when they arrived, officials whispering behind papers and seals, members of the ton leaning in with the restless anticipation of spectators awaiting a final act. Brantham stood restrained at the far side of the room, posture stiff with indignation, the arrogance in his eyes flickering with the smallest hint of doubt. Celia forced her breath to slow, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her tremble. Aldric took his place beside her, his quiet presence an anchor amid the chaos. When the council members entered, the room fell into a heavy silence, every heartbeat, every breath poised for the moment of truth. The verdict was delivered with deliberate gravity. The council declared Celia's engagement contract null due to coercion, citing the overwhelming evidence Aldric had provided. Furthermore, Brantham would face formal investigation for extortion, bribery, and attempted abduction, his assets temporarily seized pending the inquiry's conclusion. A murmur rippled through the chamber, shock, outrage, vindication, and for a moment Celia felt the world tilt beneath her, unsure whether she might collapse beneath the magnitude of the decision. But then Aldric's hand hovered near her back, not touching, yet offering the grounding warmth of his nearness, and she steadied. Brantham erupted in fury, his mask shattering as he hurled accusations and threats. Guards restrained him easily, but his final glare landed on Celia, sharp enough to chill her blood. Yet instead of fear, she felt something else rise inside her, defiance forged from everything she had survived. She met his gaze without flinching, and for the first time, he looked away first. The power he once wielded over her had fractured completely, broken by truth, by courage, by the unwavering shield Aldric had become. When the chamber finally dismissed, Celia stepped outside with a breath that felt like her first in months, clean, whole, free. Aldric walked beside her in silence, but the emotions in his eyes told her everything he would not voice yet. She realized then that this victory was not merely the end of Brantham's hold, it was the beginning of the life she had thought forever lost. And as Aldric offered his hand to help her into the carriage, their fingers brushed in a lingering moment that carried a promise neither dared speak aloud. Now that the shadows had lifted, nothing remained between them but the truth of what they had become to one another. The carriage ride back to Graymoor passed in a silence that felt different from all those before it, lighter, warmer, threaded with the fragile beginnings of something neither Celia nor Aldric had yet dared to name. Celia stared out at the passing countryside, the winter soft light brushing the fields in pale gold, and for the first time in months she felt the world beyond her window expand rather than close in around her. Freedom settled over her not as a distant dream but as a quiet truth, a truth so new she scarcely knew how to hold it. She was no longer bound to Brantham, no longer hunted, no longer defined by fear. She had stood before the council and reclaimed her own life, and the realization unfurled inside her with a tenderness that made her eyes sting. Aldric sat across from her, his posture disciplined as ever, yet his gaze softened whenever it drifted toward her. There was pride in his eyes, deep, unmistakable pride, but also something gentler, warmer, restrained only by a discipline he clung to out of habit rather than necessity. Celia wondered whether he felt the same dizzy mix of possibility and uncertainty that fluttered through her chest, but she lacked the courage to break the delicate silence. Instead, she let the unspoken grow between them, filling the space with a quiet anticipation. When the carriage stopped before Graymoor's grand steps, Aldric helped her down with a care that made her breath catch. His hand lingered around hers, not in impropriety but in an unguarded moment of connection that carried far more meaning than words could. They walked side by side through the entrance hall, the servants offering warm smiles now that danger had lifted from the estate, and Celia felt herself wrapped in a sense of belonging she had not expected to find. Aldric paused near the foot of the staircase, turning toward her with a seriousness that softened at the edges. He told her she was free now, truly free, and could choose any path she wished, return to her extended family, carve a life elsewhere, or remain at Graymoor as long as she desired. His voice wavered almost imperceptibly on the final words, as though the possibility of her leaving cut deeper than he allowed to show. Celia's heart trembled at the thought. She looked up at him and saw not the Duke who had rescued her, but the man who had stood beside her through every moment of fear, who had believed in her strength before she knew it existed, who had nearly crossed the boundary between them more than once before pulling himself back with aching restraint. For the first time, the choice before her felt entirely her own, and as she held his gaze, warm and steady in the quiet hall, she realized the path she wished to take led nowhere but here, toward the man who had become the center of her courage and the keeper of her heart. Evening settled gently over Graymoor, the sky fading into shades of lavender and rose as lanterns flickered to life across the estate. Celia stood on the terrace overlooking the gardens, the cool air brushing against her skin as she tried to make sense of the new world unfolding before her. Freedom felt both exhilarating and terrifying, for with it came choices, real choices, ones she had never imagined she would have the right to make. And at the heart of every possibility lay Aldric, a constant presence in her thoughts, in her breath, in the trembling warmth she felt whenever her gaze met his. She wondered whether the bond between them was wishful thinking or something deeper, something he felt just as strongly but restrained out of honor. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, steady and unmistakable against the stone floor. When Aldric stepped onto the terrace, the lantern light softened the edges of his stern features, revealing exhaustion, relief, and an emotion he no longer managed to hide completely. He stopped a few paces from her, as though crossing that remaining distance required more courage than facing Brantham ever had. Celia turned toward him, heart thudding, and for a moment neither spoke. The silence pulsed between them, charged with everything unspoken since the night he nearly kissed her. Aldric inhaled slowly, his voice low as he asked whether she felt ready, truly ready, to step into a life free of fear. She answered without hesitation, Yes, she had faced the worst and survived. She was not the fragile girl who had once trembled at Brantham's threats. She had become someone capable of standing beside a man like Aldric without shrinking beneath his shadow. His gaze softened at her words, pride flickering through it, followed by an uncertainty she rarely saw in him. He confessed then, carefully, painfully, that he had struggled every day to keep proper distance, that protecting her had become far more personal than he intended, that he feared wanting her before she had the freedom to choose anything for herself. Her breath caught, warmth blooming through her chest as the truth settled gently between them. She stepped closer, closing the space he could not bring himself to cross. She told him her feelings were not born of gratitude or dependence, but of the man he truly was, the strength he showed, the gentleness he tried to hide, the unwavering belief he had placed in her long before she believed in herself. Aldric's composure broke in a single, quiet breath. For the first time, he did not step back. He reached for her hand, fingers trembling as they closed around hers, and the world seemed to still as their gazes held. No kiss passed between them yet, no promise formed aloud, but in that moment, the truth settled completely. They were no longer circling something forbidden. They were finally standing at the threshold of something real, something chosen, something neither of them would walk away from now that fate had given them the chance to speak their hearts at last. Night deepened around Graymoor, settling like a velvet curtain over the terrace where Celia and Aldric still stood hand in hand, neither willing to break the fragile, luminous moment that had formed between them. The lanterns swayed in the soft evening breeze, casting warm golden halos across Aldric's features, making him appear both impossibly strong and achingly human. Celia felt her breath catch as she studied him, the man who had risked reputation, power, even his own safety to protect her. For so long she had admired him from a careful distance, uncertain whether the tenderness she sensed in him was real or merely her heart's hopeful longing. But now the truth hovered in the air between them, palpable and warm, waiting for one of them to give it voice. Aldric was the first to look away, the movement small but telling. His fingers tightened around hers before releasing, as though afraid that holding on too long might break whatever fragile line still separated desire from impropriety. He stepped back a pace, raking a hand through his hair with the kind of unrest she had rarely seen him display. He confessed that he had tried, truly tried, to keep his feelings buried, believing it was the only honorable choice while she lived under his protection. But the moment he saw her stand before the council, unwavering in her courage, something inside him broke free of its quiet cage. He could no longer pretend that his care for her was anything less than the deepest truth he carried. Celia felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of hearing aloud what her heart had long suspected. She moved toward him slowly, her steps soft in the lantern light, until she stood close enough to feel the tremor in his breath. She told him she did not want distance, nor the coldness of duty restraining the warmth they both felt. Her voice wavered, but she pressed on, admitting she felt connected to him, not because he had saved her, but because he had seen her, believed in her, walked beside her through every moment of fear, and stood with her in every triumph. The truth in her words seemed to shatter the last barrier he clung to. Aldric reached out again, this time without hesitation, his hands cupping hers with a gentleness that belied the strength in them. His voice dropped to a whisper as he told her he wanted her, not as a responsibility, not as someone to shelter, but as the woman he had come to cherish far beyond what he ever expected or thought himself worthy of. The raw honesty in his gaze stole her breath, and though he still did not kiss her, the promise in his closeness, soft, steady, undeniable, was more intimate than any touch. For the first time, neither of them looked away. Neither retreated. The confession, long restrained, finally found its home in the quiet night between them. The next morning dawned with a softness Celia had never before felt at Graymoor, as though the entire estate understood that something within its walls had shifted, quietly, irrevocably. Sunlight spilled across the terrace where she and Aldric had stood the night before, the memory of his confession warming her cheeks even now. She dressed slowly, her heart fluttering in a rhythm that was no longer anxious but hopeful, full of the tender anticipation of a future she had scarcely dared to imagine. When she descended the staircase, she expected the usual formality that Aldric wrapped himself in like armor each morning, but instead she found him waiting at the foot of the steps, posture tall, yet softened by an expression she had only recently begun to understand. He greeted her with a warmth that made her breath catch, his gaze lingering with an openness he no longer attempted to hide. They walked together through the morning halls, neither speaking at first, both wrapped in the fragile sweetness of new understanding. When they stepped into the gardens, mist still clinging to the hedges, Aldric finally broke the silence. He confessed that he had lain awake most of the night, not from fear or turmoil, but because the thought of a future with her had taken root so deeply he could not close his eyes without seeing it. Celia's heart fluttered at the admission, the words settling into her like sunlight after years of winter. They stopped near the rose arbor, the air heavy with blossoms, the world quiet save for the faint rustle of leaves. Aldric turned to face her fully, and the tenderness in his eyes made her chest ache with something warm and steady. He reached for her hand, brushing his thumb lightly across her knuckles as though asking permission without words. Celia stepped closer, giving him every answer he needed in the soft rise of her breath. He told her he wished to court her properly, that she deserved not haste but reverence, not secrecy but honor. Yet even as he spoke of restraint, his voice trembled with the longing he could no longer deny. Celia lifted a hand to his cheek, her fingers brushing the edge of the carefully held composure he had worn for so long. Aldric closed his eyes at her touch, a quiet exhale slipping from him, and when he opened them again, the depth of emotion there stole her breath entirely. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, every opportunity to reconsider, but she moved toward him with equal certainty, meeting him halfway. Their lips met in a kiss both tender and inevitable, a soft, breath-stealing promise shaped by all the restraint they had held, all the longing they had carried, all the hope newly blooming between them. It was not a desperate kiss but a reverent one, the beginning of something chosen, cherished, and wholly theirs. And when they drew apart, neither spoke, words were unnecessary. The truth lived in the quiet smile they shared, in the closeness neither stepped away from, in the future that finally felt real. In the days that followed their first kiss, Graymoor seemed to breathe easier, its quiet halls warmed by a newfound gentleness that echoed the shift within Celia and Aldric themselves. Their interactions no longer danced on the edge of unspoken longing. Instead, a tender certainty grew between them, delicate yet steady, like a young vine curling towards sunlight. Celia found herself smiling more easily, moving through the estate with a lightness she had never known, while Aldric, once all rigid control and guarded distance, now allowed moments of softness to break through, lingering looks, quiet laughter, the subtle brush of his hand against hers as though he could not quite bear to let her drift too far from reach. Yet even in their closeness, she sensed a careful patience in him, a restraint not born of fear, but of respect. One late afternoon, as warm light poured through the tall windows of the west gallery, Aldric sought her out with a seriousness that made her pulse quicken. He guided her to a quiet alcove overlooking the grounds, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. There, with the garden stretched before them and the scent of lilacs drifting through the open doors, he spoke with a depth she felt down to her bones. He told her he wished to offer her a future, not assume one. He wanted her to choose freely, without the shadow of obligation or gratitude shaping her decision. She was no longer under his protection. The council's ruling had given her a clean path forward. Whatever choice she made now would belong entirely to her. The sincerity in his voice wrapped around her like a warm, trembling shield. Celia listened, heart aching with tenderness as he explained that loving her, he used the word softly, reverently, meant giving her space to walk whatever path she desired, even if it led somewhere he could not follow. He told her he would never cage her, never claim her, unless she reached for him first. His words, so full of restraint and honesty, made her see again the man beneath the title, honorable to the point of self-sacrifice, gentle despite his stern exterior, and deeply, painfully in love. Celia stepped closer, lifting his hand and pressing it to her heart. She told him her freedom was no longer something she feared losing, it was something she wanted to share. She chose him, not because he had saved her, but because he had taught her how to save herself, because with him she felt not sheltered, but seen. Aldric's breath stilled, emotion flickering through his gaze in a way that broke and mended her all at once. He kissed her hand with a reverence that made her knees weaken, and in that quiet alcove, their future began to take shape, not as a rescue, but as a partnership built from courage, tenderness, and the kind of love born only after surviving the darkest storms together. The morning Aldric brought Celia to the eastern gardens felt touched by quiet anticipation, the kind that settled softly rather than stirred with urgency. Dew clung to the roses, the air cool and fragrant, and Celia sensed something shifting in him even before he spoke. He walked beside her without the heaviness of duty guiding his steps, Instead, there was a gentleness in the way he glanced toward her, as though making sure she still walked freely, unburdened by expectation. When they reached the small stone fountain at the garden's center, he paused, drawing a steady breath. His voice, when it came, held both strength and vulnerability. He told her he wished to ask a question not as a duke, nor as her protector, but simply as a man who loved her deeply. There was no promise of grandeur, no presumption intertwined with his words, only sincerity shaped by months of shared fear, courage, and quiet, blooming affection. He asked whether she would consider a life with him, not bound by necessity but by choice. Celia felt warmth rise through her chest, her heart answering before her lips even formed the words. She told him yes, because choosing him had become the most natural truth she had ever known. The day of their wedding dawned with a gentleness that felt almost unreal to Celia, as though the world itself wished to honor the quiet journey that had brought her here. Sunlight streamed through Graymoor's chapel windows, warm and golden, washing the space in a soft radiance that bore no resemblance to the shadows of her past. As she walked down the aisle, her steps unhurried and her heart sure, she saw Aldric waiting for her, not the imposing duke the world revered, but the man who had offered her freedom before asking for her hand. His expression softened the moment their eyes met, a tenderness unfolding across his features that made the breath catch in her throat. When she reached him, he took her hands with reverence, as though holding something precious he had long vowed to protect. The vows they spoke were simple, yet profound, shaped not by obligation but by the quiet certainty of two souls who had already weathered storms side by side. There was no fear, no doubt, only the steady warmth of belonging. And when Aldric drew her into their first kiss as husband and wife, it felt not like a beginning, but like the truth their hearts had been moving toward all along. Their first evening as husband and wife unfolded not in grandeur but in quiet, golden warmth, the kind that felt both fragile and eternal. Graymoor's halls, once shadowed by fear and secrecy, now glowed with gentle candlelight as Celia walked beside Aldric through the home that had transformed from a refuge into the heart of their new life. He watched her with a tenderness free of restraint, every trace of the guarded duke replaced by a man whose love no longer needed hiding. When they reached the terrace overlooking the moonlit gardens, Celia leaned into him, the familiar steadiness of his presence wrapping around her like a vow renewed with every breath. Aldric spoke softly of their future, of a life shaped not by duty or danger, but by the shared strength they had forged together. Celia felt her heart swell with gratitude, not for being saved, but for being chosen, for being seen, for being loved without condition. She whispered her own promises in return, her voice steady with the courage he had helped her reclaim. And as the night deepened around them, their hands intertwined, Celia understood that the darkness they had overcome had only made the light before them shine brighter than she had ever imagined.